Welcome to our panel discussion. Hashtag Say Her Name, Womanist Theology, Activism, and Movement Making Women and Girls. Today's forum is sponsored by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. And Union Presbyterian Seminary's new Master of Arts in Public Theology. Are you called to be a Christian leader in the public square? Know someone considering theological education? Contact our admissions directors at admissions@upsem.edu. Our panelists are Dr. Stephanie Y. Mitchum, a professor in the Department of Religious Studies and the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of South Carolina. Reverend Dr. Michelle E. Watkins, Assistant Professor of Theology and Religious Studies at the University of San Diego. Dr. Amy Victoria Adkins Jones, Assistant Professor of Theology and African Diaspora Studies at Boston College. Reverend Fanta Lansden, Associate Professor of Youth, Young Adults, and Discipleship at C.N. Jenkins Memorial Presbyterian Church, and founder of Fanta Lansden Ministries in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our host and moderator is the Reverend Melanie Jones, Assistant Professor of Ethics and Theology and Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Reverend Jones, the floor is yours.
Welcome to our Just Talk series that is co-sponsored again by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, as well as the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. We are so excited that you joined us tonight on this platform, and we look forward to having more dialogue and conversation concerning our theme. I want to begin our conversation tonight by giving us a brief introduction of womanism and to set the tone for our conversation. The term womanist comes from the Black idiomatic expression, you actin' womanish, that is derived from Black Southern folk culture of a mother speaking to her girl child. Alice Walker, a brilliant poet and novelist, most notably known for her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Color Purple, defined the term in her classic 1983 collection of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, Womanist Prose. Since the 1980s, Black women religious thinkers and leaders have adopted and adapted womanist as a term to name a transdisciplinary approach to the academic study of religion and as a prophetic movement that engages the survival and liberation of Black women and all persons seeking justice. Though many may name Walker's definition as a point of departure, I do want to make clear that the womanist paradigm has taken shape since the 1980s in multiple academic disciplines, including English, literature, history, theater and film studies, communication and media studies, political science, psychology, anthropology, social work, and gender and sexuality studies, architecture and urban studies, and then, of course, most notably, religious studies. While we know that Katie Geneva Cannon, Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, was the first to source the term womanist to engage God talk and moral agency of Black women, we point to Dolores Williams, who was the first to speak of womanist theology in her 1987 article, Womanist Theology, Black Women's Voices. Here she suggests, quote, the womanist theologian must search for the voices, actions, opinions, experience, and faith of women whose names sometimes slip into the male-centered rendering of Black history, but whose actual stories remain remote. To invisibilize is to make invisible, to marginalize, as to erase the presence or the contributions of. In December of 2014, the African American Policy Forum and Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies developed the Say Her Name campaign as a way to confront the invisibilizing of stories of Black women and girls who are, too, victimized by racist police brutality and violence. In a contemporary era, Black women and girls face compounding assaults at the hands of police and violent attackers from as young as age 7 to as elder as age 93. We point to March 13 as a 1 year marker, not only of our world's recognition of COVID-19, but also the day in which we recognize that a 26-year-old woman by the name of Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville, Kentucky, and her story continues. The mothers of the movement, representing numerous Black women whose children and relatives have been killed by police brutality and gun violence, continue to remind us that when terror strikes Black families and Black women are often the ones who are left to deal with the scars. Our question is simple tonight. What shall womanist theology say to these things? We have gathered during this Women's History Month womanist theologians who are not only active in their academic guilds and in their professions, but are also concerned about what is happening in terms of movement making and the foregrounding of womanist theology in various ecclesial communities as well as communities on the ground. So I am excited not only to have this important and timely conversation, but because of the voices that are represented here with us. I want to invite all folks who have joined in with us that as we engage in this conversation, that you drop questions, notes, comments in the chats, and that we will open up a space after beginning our dialogue with panelists in order to engage your questions as they come in. So tonight, as we jump into the conversation, Say Her Name, Womanist Theology, Activism, and Movement Making, I want to begin our questions pointing with first Reverend Dr. Michelle Watkins. I know your work has been on violence against women and girls, Black women and girls in particular, and that this is not a new subject or topic. We might point to biblical texts of terror with stories of Hagar or Jephthah's daughter or even Tamar and other women. But contextually, we know from Breonna's story and many others, Sandra Bland, and the list goes on, that violence against Black women and girls is happening in a contemporary era. What should we continue to do, Dr. Watkins, as we begin to construct womanist systematic theologies that may have a particular attention to dismantling these systems of violence and oppression?
So thank you, Professor Jones, for a beautiful introduction and for the opportunity to be in virtual community with my sisters and broader community. So first and foremost, it is no secret, and I think it is imperative that we understand that Black women's bodies are not protected under the law. And one of the first and foremost assumptions that we should operate out of is understanding the theological underpinning claims, ideologies that undergird laws within our American system. Womanist theology is first clarified in terms of what our job is by the oracle, Dolores Williams, in Sisters in the Wilderness, as she notes that the job of womanist theology is to raise questions that are disruptive and that call into a space of interrogation of the viability, the usefulness of all traditional doctrine, whether that is perpetuated or espoused within Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodox Christianity, whatever traditions we draw from, even within our Africana traditions. We have to question and interrogate the viability for the purpose of not just troubling theological waters, just to be troublemakers, but to be a kind of theological exorcist, if we might say. Womanist theology, I also think it's important, out of that call to action from Dr. Williams, to develop a continually operational definition of what womanist theology is and does. There's a way that when we claim belonging or claim the tag of systematic theology, that we both perpetuate a Western theological framework that has not served us, yet the systematic aspect of womanist theology, I interpret and I teach and I write as a kind of political discipleship strategizing, right? So it's a different than trying to lock in or even claim doctrinal uniformity, but to insert, encourage, practice, cultivate insurrectionist theological reflection. As I think about insurrection and the job of womanist systematic theology within a climate where Black women's bodies are targeted, so not just subjugated to violence, but targeted, seen as invitations to violence, that womanist work is insurrectionist by virtue of its distinctive methodologies, right? It interrupts, it disrupts, it bridles, muffles, and exercises death-dealing presumptions and assumptions about the nature of God and creation. And last, to stay within the time frame, I would say the most consummate doctrine, I might argue the most consummate doctrine within womanist systematic theology is the doctrine of self-love. The doctrine of self-love is the most consummate for me because it is the lifeline through which all other theological themes and ethical tenets are not only developed, but can be sustained. So theological themes such as innate divinity of Black women's embodiment and personhood, divine omnipresence through the Spirit in all creation, survival as a theological virtue, are really the cornerstone of these theological themes is the doctrine of self-love. And I'll leave that there as we can begin thinking about building on the way that self-love itself can be a operational ethic, right? Redemptive self-love being an operational ethic for our justice pursuits. And lastly, and for real, last on this point is I think self-love prompts us to utilize resources that are apparent, that are readily available. But as we see through these pursuits within the criminal justice system, we cannot rely solely or even put our hope in these systems to protect Black women. And so I do believe, I am not one that believes in the American experiment and the American project. I don't believe in the Republic and all of this, I'm just not an optimist in that regard. And so I am thinking about and motivated to think about how we can operate in both the dominant space of the public sphere, as well as in the shadows, right? The alternate spaces. What happens when we begin to strategize when the recording is off, right?
I think you had me at theological exorcist, which reminds me of this kind of concept of exorcising evil, right? That the task of womanist theology is to discern these interlocking systems of oppression, but we're also engaged of the work of dismantling them, and that is the task of an exorcist. So I was right there with you. I'm thinking of this, Dr. Amy. We are right here in this Lenten season, right? In a time of deep reflection. And as we think about not only the Lenten season, I'm getting ready for Good Friday as a preacher. So we're already thinking about these texts that we see of Jesus's mother, right? Beholding this crucifix moment, whether it's woman, behold thy son, whether it is, right, all of the language in which we get of Jesus's final days and his mother being there, right, for this devastating moment. And so that got me thinking about this being certainly in relation to mothers of the movement who are left to deal with the scars, right, of violence against their children, and are called to now move mountains, really to do continue their legacies by making their stories known. Your work, of course, in Mariology, but beyond that, you've been thinking deeply about this. So how do we interpret these mothers of the movement in connection to Mariology?
Thank you. Good, Reverend Doctor. I appreciate the invitation and just being here with my sisters, some new, some old. So thank you again for inviting me. And thank you for the question. My work as a professor at Boston College, which is a Jesuit institution, but I grew up good and Baptist and am a Baptist minister as well. And so my invitation to Mariology has been my sort of formative claim from doctoral work into, soon to be published work, is that Mary is Black. And so for all of the ways that we see and imagine the space of Jesus on the cross, and all of the ways that our womanist theologies in particular have interrogated those notions of suffering and asked questions more deeply about what is happening with Black women, Black women's bodies, non-binary femmes bodies, trans Black women, cisgender Black women's bodies, EN, XN, YN, asking these questions and wanting to think intersectionally, wanting to think with a broader lens. Mary is a figure who for me is someone that our Protestant traditions, which Black liberation theology rises out of, given sort of the legacy and history of the Black church, already failed to pay much attention to. We are happy to take Jesus, give the deuces to Mary, as I like to say, and that's something that frequently is noted as, something that separates us from our Catholic or Orthodox siblings in their traditions. But there's a lot that is lost, I think, around, gender in that. I think that there's a lot that that is a misgiven. And so Black Catholic womanist scholars like Diana Hayes have been calling for, attention to Black Black Madonna traditions, or attention to Mary with new, womanist eyes. And so that work is a natural connection for me in terms of our continuing, as my sister, Reverend Dr. Michelle said, our continuing dismantling of issues that come from the Theological Academy, but also as we continue to ask questions about the lived experience, as we continue to ask questions about violence against Black women. A natural place to turn are our texts that feature women who were risking their lives and women who were up against questions and situations and circumstances that are very familiar to anyone, particularly growing up or navigating the political and racial landscape of the United States. It's very natural to ask these kinds of questions because the issue of violence against Black women and girls is not a patriotic issue. It is a global issue that we are continuing to ask questions about and fight. And so when we think about mothers of the movement, when we think about Sabrina Fulton and Gwen Carr and Samaria Rice, Leslie McSpadden, Geneva Reed Vial, Cleopatra Pendleton Crowley, Tamika Palmer, we so often see Black women who have lost their children to violence in this way, standing up. But I question the way that we think about this theologically. Mary is a helpful resource because what does it mean to be a mother of a child who is executed in front of your eyes at the hands of the state? And I think that there are a couple of things that Mary, in particular regard to what we are seeing in this season, this particular iteration of videotaped violence and of police killings and police murders in our country. Mary's a resource absolutely for our grief. What does it mean for us in the thereafter? On the cross, like you said, we preach it. I'm getting ready to every Good Friday at 7 last words. I think it's too often not given enough attention, but of course, those are my biases. But to behold thy mother, what are the ethics and practices of care and community through loss? So many of us have lost so much, even outside of state violence. So many of us have lost so much after this year. And I think that that's an ongoing question for our churches and our ecclesial spaces. What is care going to look like after this? What are we going to do, and how are we going to change? What's going to be different? What are we not going to go back to when we are able to gather again? I think that Mary is also an incredible resource for our accountability to ourselves and to our communities in different ways. What does it mean to be present and listen to a mother or a parent's cry? What does it mean to be galvanized around protest? What does it mean to have people near and far come together and be swept up in radical love and the power of protest and resilience that lives and presses on, that attempts to make meaning out of senseless death, that continues to press into otherwise imaginations and worlds? What does it mean for us to listen? But also, I think in our particular moment, there's a question that is raised for me. What does it mean that so many people want to take up your child's name or your child's legacy, potentially for their own profit and gain? And what does that mean when you have spoken and you are present, but you continue to be invisibilized inside of that? I think that there's a deep ethic and question of accountability, particularly given our communication networks as they exist now, to ask some real questions and to sit down and listen to what perhaps the most public of us are not necessarily able to say or given voice or recognized in the same way. And I would also say that Mary, and particularly our histories of Black Madonnas, this is a resource inherent to the Christian tradition that names Black women's flesh in particular as holy and sacred. And so Mariology, and particularly the womanist Mariology that I work on, helps us to ask better questions, helps us to hold each other and ourselves better accountable, and gives us a sense of a reminder of joy, a reminder of celebration, a reminder of the sources of our resilience. As a woman who literally gives birth, gives flesh to divinity, gives birth to a movement herself.
Yes, yes, and yes. As you were talking, I was thinking of the documentary from Breonna Taylor's mother when she recalls that the police waited almost a whole 24 hours before they actually had said Breonna had transitioned. And I mean, we could go back to Michael Brown in terms of his mom waiting and seeing the body, and so many others seeing his body laying there in that Canfield apartment complex. I mean, this story kind of repeats itself in terms of this delay and this sense that so many people are now taking their children's name as a way to think about movement forward. But what does that mean still for the mothers? Thank you, Dr. Amy, for that. I see we have another voice here. Welcome, Dr. Mitchum, to the platform. We're so glad to have you and want to get you in here for our conversation. I was certainly radicalized by your my first introduction to your book, Introduction to Womanist Theology, which is still a foregrounding text for me. I still use it in my intro classes in theology because it gives a good opener and a good understanding of the discourse for folks who are just beginning the journey, or for folks who have been understanding what womanist theology is for a while and are just new to certain themes and certain aspects of the discourse. So, Dr. Mitchum, I think my question is really aimed towards, since introducing womanist theology, how do you think womanism has evolved and is perhaps making new strides for us to answer the questions we're raising today?
Talk to you all. I'm excited to talk with you younger scholars who are moving this forward and who are finding ways to reinvigorate discussions of womanist thought and womanist theology. I think it's critically important. I think it's critically important that Black women have a space where we can go, where we can find ourselves. I want to say many of the things you were saying just triggered what Dr. Adkins Jones was saying, where she was talking about Mariology. One of the most significant images in my life was the shot of Emmett Till in the casket. I saw that in Jet when I was young, very young, and realizing that the reason that casket was open was because Mamie Till, his mother, said, "Leave that casket open, let them see what they do." That state-sponsored, state-supported murder is directly connected to the idea of the mothers of the movement. Women who are still saying, "Leave the casket open, let them see what has been done to my child." And so I think it gets a little bit more muddied now because we have a couple of other things that are influencing where we are. One of them is the issue of reparations. What does that mean? Is it even possible? I have a piece of hair sticking up. It's driving me crazy. Is it even possible to really have reparations for the past? And then people start getting into the ADOH and all that, all those kinds of things. So what does reparations mean? And then Dr. Watkins was speaking about whether or not we can even believe in the American dream. And I think that's important. So I'm going to talk for a hot minute about where my own research path has gone. I have continued to branch out. I look at issues of African American health and folk healing, but I also look at issues of human rights. The issues of human rights are critical, I think. One of the things I said in my last book is actually a quote from Ossie Davis, who started off his talk saying, "We in the civil rights movement were wrong. We were fighting for civil rights. We should have been fighting for human rights." And I think we continue to have these problems over and over. We continue to have these murders. We just had some some senator who was saying that what happened on January 6th didn't bother him. If they had been some Black Lives Matter people, Black Lives Matter movement people, he might have been scared then, but he wasn't scared. It was just some justice-loving people who were protesting. That is so vile, but it is so real. Here in South Carolina, there have been repeated incidents where police have done things over and over. They may have taken down the Confederate flag, but we're still dealing with a history of enslavement, a history of oppression. So how do we find these human rights? I think that womanist thought, what you all are doing, how you all are continuing, is critically important to begin to flesh out what it means to be a person committed to human rights, to be a person who is interested in leading a community to justice. So it's never just about a woman by herself. It is consistently, womanist thought is consistently based on community and community values. And I think that is part of the greatest gift that continues. We can evolve as much as we want to, but we keep coming back to those core questions. What happens to the mothers of the movement? How do we live in this society? The work I do now also deals a lot with African diaspora. So I'm traveling quite often to the continent. And that has also influenced, because I see how colonialism has just messed us up all everywhere. We just messed up. And so we're finding ways out of that. Womanist thought, womanist theology, womanist voices, womanist activism, womanist ethics, all of those ways create new opportunities to not define who we are as human beings, but to claim who we are as children of the divine.
Absolutely. I think this insistence on being concerned with communal wellness is at the center of womanist theology. One of the things that I often get as I travel across the country is, how can womanism translate to local communities, particularly to congregations? And so I've been thinking about this in terms of, I believe womanism loses its prophetic edge if there is no word for how this has feet on the ground in terms of conversations with church women or even folks outside the church. Reverend Fanta, in your ministry and in your work, how do you think womanist theology is translating into the ministry and mission of local congregations?
Well, first, thank you, Reverend Jones, for the opportunity to be in this sacred space with the other panelists, my sisters. It's good to be with you all this evening. I count it as a blessing and an honor. So how does this womanist theology translate into the ministry and just the core context of what we do as a congregation? First, I think that it centralizes the voice of Black women. We realize oftentimes within congregations, there's a male-dominant voice. I think that there is a gift in having womanist theology that centralizes the Black woman's voice, but experience, as it is merged into the biblical story. You look at your personal story and the biblical story, and you see a Christ story. There's an example of the womanist theologian, writer, author, amazing woman, Reverend Dr. Renita Wims, that has written the book Just a Sister Away, where she takes the biblical stories and she just really digs in and makes it so palatable for women, Black women, to really do Bible studies or to dig into, to see themselves, to hear their experiences, and to really be liberated. And I think that's a part of what women's theology does too. It connects to liberation and healing and wholeness and love and valuing our voices and the diversity that we find. Reverend Jones, as you had talked about, Alice Walker coined womanist, the term womanist, and a part of her definition says that we're committed to survival and wholeness of entire people. So I think it goes beyond just Black women. Of course, it is focused on Black women's voices, but I think women's theology is about a liberation of entire people. And in doing that, is really speaking to anyone who is suffering under the weight and the hands of the oppressor, a woman who seeks for their liberation, their empowerment, and the value of their voices. So you can imagine the diversity of people that we get coming into the church. Persons who may be oppressed by addiction, or there may be mental health concerns that they have. But womanist theology, I believe, speaks directly to that and the various ills and things that begin to plague us in this world. Another thing is Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, as a womanist theologian, her voice has liberated many and paved the way for many women in what is now known as the PCUSA, because she was the first Black woman of African descent that was ordained in the PCUSA. And her work liberates me, liberates others, and the people she has poured into have come to help to liberate people by finding their voice and becoming grounded in this call as leaders within the church or leaders within the world. So I think that women's theology helps to push back against some of that misogyny and the patriarchy sometimes that we find within congregations and within the world, the sexism that we find. And there are other isms. And women's theology begins to value the women's voices and their leadership and the power of their leadership and the anointing that they have and just how they move in the world in the intricacies that they do. And it just values all of that. And then women's theology translates into the mission and ministry of congregation by calling us closer into our most authentic selves as the beloved child of God. And then we can't overlook that women's theology also speaks to the injustices such as what has happened to Breonna Taylor's murder. And it calls out the systemic racism and the devaluing of women's lives, Black women's bodies, and then calls to honor them, to seek after justice, and to move forward with that activism.
Yeah, I think You're right on. When we talk about, I mentioned it earlier, Dolores Williams' article, Womanist Theology, Black Women's Voices. She says that a womanist theological method should have kind of four major aims. It should be multi-dialogical, which means it speaks to, for, and from communities that exist, from the academy to the church, from the church to the community, and back and forth, that it should be liturgical in its intent, that it should be didactic, teachable, and that it should be mindful of the female imagery in terms of valuing the Black divine feminine as well. And so I want to open up our panel here to some questions that all of us can jump in on as you feel open to it, and then we'll take some questions from the chat. I watched, and maybe you watched, the Black Church PBS series a few weeks ago, and there, I was disturbed. There was some points of affirmation and some points that I think were meaningful for the series, but I was disturbed that the term womanist theology or womanism was never mentioned in the 2-part series. And I think that still raises questions for me about how we might be able to speak to, as womanist theologians, speak to the struggle that women have endured and are enduring in the Black church historically and contemporarily. So anyone can jump in.
So I would just say that there is two, Reverend Dr. Sister Melva Sampson teaches us there can be two things can be true at the same time, right? So the first is we celebrate the codification, the use of resources to lift up the many ways and the great influential presence and work of the Black church, and to be able to tell part of that story on a national stage is unprecedented in the way that in the form that it was mediated. So while we celebrate, we also interrogate, right? So back to Dolores Williams's call for womanist theology to interrogate all doctrine, but also demonarchy, right? And which is headed largely, talking about white male and white female dominated systems that devalue, that defile Black women. And so when we talk about the PBS documentary, we celebrate, but we also interrogate the ways that it participates in demonarchy, right? By virtue of catering to white benefactors that require the silencing of Black women. And so we can celebrate, right, when we hear Barbara Savage and Evelyn Higginbotham teach us and teach the world, about the ways that Black women have asserted their voices and claimed their divine right to preach, to teach, to partake in the body of Christ, while also questioning why womanist theology was edited out. So not even thinking about, it's not present, or it wasn't a part of the discussion, but why is this not an editorial priority for inclusion? I mean, that's a question we might ask, Dr. Gates and his production team and all of that. But I do think even in the framing of it not only the silencing of Black women, right? Like, so you can, it's the equivalent of you can preach or you can teach, but not from the pulpit, right? So it's that structural kind of analogous relationship. While at the same time, what was it really for Black people? I mean, how can you start the story about the Black church by way of Sepulveda Island? You know, my work is in early Christianities, and particularly the intersections of patristic and womanist thought. And so I was disturbed that we're starting the story within the context of enslavement and having to explain, trying to explain. So we only get to the continent by way of enslavement. So there's so many questions, I have so many questions, but it does participate. We can celebrate it, but we need to interrogate how it participates. Even in our sharing of it, it participates in the silencing, which is a form of devaluing and defiling Black women.
I think you're right on. I mean, this question of editing is also a kind of invisibilization, right? Womanist theology, this ain't new. We're 40 years in the making. I mean, if you can talk about hip hop and the church, then you ought to be talking about womanist theology and the Black church, because they run the same historical paradigms in terms of, or they're parallel in terms of chronology. And so we choose what is valuable to the story, to stories that we shape that often, again, invisibilize Black women's experiences. Any other voices there? Yeah, Dr. Mitchum.
Divide. There's a theoretical divide as well. And we see that being played out with the argument over the 1619 Project. When did America start? Versus the 1776 Unites. By starting with enslavement, this is kind of like in the 1776 Unites camp. It's cleaning it up. It's prettying up the story. It's not messy. And if you also think about who Black women are today, the angry Black woman, the forward Black woman, the annoying Black woman, yeah, why we can show them singing. You know, so I just think there is still, as Dr. Higginbotham says, there is still politics going on where we're trying to be accepted. So it's not just the funders, because the 1619 Project was actually under the New York Times. It's how we, as scholars, as leaders, as ministers, how we decide, okay, we're going to push this forward. We're going to tell the truth. We're going to tell the whole truth, and we're going to honor everybody. And I think that is the danger of womanist thought. That is the danger of womanist theology and ethics. The ability to truth tell. Kind of annoying, but it's needed.
Absolutely. This is necessary work. Donna Van Hook, who's watching us from Facebook, she's asking the question here: how do we relate womanism to the thought of the beloved community?
Hi, Reverend Van Hook. If I've got the right person, I'm not on Facebook. So, but I do believe I know who this is. So the notion of beloved community, I think, is a complicated notion. I agree completely with what has been said. We could spend the rest of the hour talking about this documentary if you really wanted to. But one of the things, again, that the documentary does is center the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. yet again, as the sort of quintessential charismatic male preaching, anointed, messianic figure in ways that don't speak to the Mahalia Jacksons or the Coretta Scott Kings or the Prathia Halls or Ella Baker, all of these folks who help make Dr. King possible. Not that he's not important, but certainly that he's not a solo savior figure, neither for the church. The Black church was not in agreement about his presence, and certainly that he was assassinated. So for as much as we continue to glorify these notions. And so the issue with beloved community is that this is a term and a concept that is frequently arguably co-opted, not only from the full scope of Dr. King's thought, but certainly toward practices or instigations around reconciliation, particularly racial reconciliation with folks who don't want to take seriously white supremacy. Too often, the move to reconciliation it is actually a move of assimilation. It continues the process of problematic memory, of amnesia around who we are. And so, yes, that's not to say that we don't desire to be reconciled, but liturgically, theologically, in order to reconcile, you have to be repentant. There has to be some naming of some accountability of how we see one another and the sin that have been committed in our communities and around our communities. So my personal take on it is that beloved community obviously has wonderful notions, but there's so much work left to be done before we can get there. That beloved community is often invoked prematurely in ways that do not yet take seriously the questions of justice, the questions of pain in our community, the questions of the ways that our nation, our government, our churches have participated in violence against Black and Brown communities, but specifically with regard to this conversation, against Black women and girls. And so I think that there's certainly a womanist thought. Again, as has been said, one of the hallmarks of womanist theology has been the uplifting of community. But I would turn to something like the Combahee River Collective that says, well, if Black women get free, we all get free. And so there's a lot of bondage still happening. And so those are places that we still need to be able to name, to call out, to do that, annoying or not speaking truth to power, to continue to press that, to continue to ask our own communal questions, because as beautiful a vision as reconciling between other communities, we still have a lot of things that are not reconciled in our own churches. We still have a lot that's not reconciled in our own communities. The question about the documentary included, this sort of notion of, well, wait a minute, not only how is it so easy or what is still so accessible with regard to the erasure of women's voices and stories? How do you so readily get away with that on and I do mean get away with that, on such a large platform? What are these stories and narratives? Who are they serving? And unfortunately, we still in our churches have Black women who are deeply underserved, who are pressured and noted by terrible theologies about their bodies, about sex, about sexuality, about identity. We're not the only ones, but we still have work to do as well. And so I have hesitancies. I would have reservations about a womanist theology. Womanist theology's commitments to beloved community, unless that notion of beloved community includes a deep sense of justice, and as Dr. Mitchum said, a deep sense of figuring out what reparation looks like.
I would add this small caveat. I don't think Black women are truly beloved in our own community. To Dr. Atkins Jones' comment, we are only beloved to the extent that we can be pandered. And so when we're able to start deconstructing and deconstructing the plantation patriarchal standards, and regendering of Black women and our bodies and personhood, we're able to deconstruct that and be able to create, construct, and fully live into healthier, life-affirming ways of being and appreciation of what we offer. And not just what we offer, but just our being. We don't have to perform in order to be beloved. And so, I question whether we can be truly beloved outside of the extent to which we are pandered, not only by outside world or even white dominant society, but particularly, and I'll use the language of Dr. Tamora Lomax, which is Black male supremacy. Mm-hmm. And our phallic worship of Black male supremacy that's innate, that's instinctual, that has been shaped without question. It's implicit, it's an implicit bias and betrayal against ourselves.
I'm sitting with all of that and looking at two things here. I'm thinking about if we are not truly beloved in our community, in our own communities, as you rightly named, Dr. Watkins, then how have we been able to kind of establish our own pathways in terms of movement making that are for our community, but also outside of the institutions who do not love us? So I'm thinking about that in terms of, can we trace womanist roots to the Black Lives Matter movement? I think Patrice Gaines asked this question a little bit differently. She says, is this why, to your point, Dr. Watkins, why the three women who co-founded BLM did not go through the church to organize? How might we link this question of unloved to how we need to create new spaces of movement making that are for our communities, but that center people who might be different from the institutions and systems and communities that have not been loving to us?
I think this is why Baby Suggs preached with the support of creation, why she preached outside of walls, because there is freedom, not only in and I mentioned this earlier this week to soon be Dr. Jones, the women of Brewster Place. There's freedom in knocking down the wall, right? But that takes time, that takes strategy inward. And I think we need multiple modes of resistance and creation. So we need to do the inside work. We also need to embrace and claim spaces, and we are doing that, right? There are Black women priests who are creating sanctuaries in virtual spaces, right? Who have been creating spaces outside of the church, for our survival. To asphyxiate our vocation is a kind of death, a social and spiritual death that Black women have been resisting since the beginning of creation.
I think we have a model with Breonna Lee as one that we could look to whenever this is 1700s, whenever she wasn't able to preach in the church for 8 years, she preached in other spaces. I have a spiritual mother that says, one of her coined phrases is, "I'm not auditioning, I am." And so it's not this sense of arrogance, it's confidence that I don't need your affirmation, I already am. And so therefore I'm going to operate in the power and the fullness of my anointing in whatever space that I need to be in. It might be a sister circle. It might be organizing like the Black Lives Matter movement. It might be in other spaces, but I think that we can create a sense of community and use our power and our anointing that has been afforded to us by God in creative ways. Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson, I think she had an article out about creating space on Facebook and preaching in that platform. And there are so many different mediums in which we can share a liberating word in our authenticity. Y'all know how we do as Black women, we just bring flavor to it that connects with people. And I think that that is the power of our voice and realizing I'm not auditioning for this. God has already called me to it. And we exercise it in ways in which it feel most authentic to ourselves.
I would agree. It is holy and sacred work to rise to an occasion. And so particularly given our churches, the history of Black churches, the ways that we have been committed to liberation and the ways that we have been deeply committed to bondage and deeply committed to subjugation and oppression within our communities. God is bigger than our buildings. Our church spaces, I think, are sacred and important because, our ancestors' hands, were on so many of those bricks and so many of those stones, and we can't forget that. But that's not the only place that God works. That's not the only place that God makes a way out of no way. And womanist theology is inherently constructive because it has been creating space. It has been going into the clearing. If you've got a praying grandma, which everyone apparently, including our narrator of the PBS documentary, loves to cite, then if you've got a praying grandma somewhere and you're grateful, then you can cite womanist theology. Because womanist theology didn't come about just, to make formal claims within the academy. It came about as a way of naming what has already been happening since before we even got on these shores. And so to think about that, to think about a God who we understand as creator and creative, I do think that we can all, womanist roots go far beyond what is formally published. I think about Alice Walker in search of our mother's gardens, right? If we go back, if we look, if we pay attention, we can see that work of divinity extends much further through when we were able to write it down in particular ways. But also, for all that has manifest, I think we can be excited. I do not think that the church has to only follow a modelship, a model of male leadership leading the way. Most of the people who wanted, the debates between the church and the movement, really, we're talking about the debates between some older, particularly prominent male leaders who wanted microphones and wanted to lay claim to women in particular way, to youth, to younger generations in certain kinds of ways. We're talking about very particular egos where most of us were happy to join in and also learn and be in conversation. And I think that we have to think about that again, what has been mentioned here, that the both and is inherent to Black feminism, that being in and out is a way that we have always seen God working, and something that we can acknowledge, and also that we can be accountable for folks who say these are not spaces that have been affirming, these are not spaces that have been welcoming, to take that critique and to say, well, then what shall we do with it? Because the ways that our church spaces and leadership have been critiqued are not incorrect. And so that's something that we have to continue to learn and grow and evolve with and from, because the project of freedom, the projects of abolition, the projects of liberation, the projects of joy are inherent to our survival and extend whether one identifies as Christian or not.
And Dr. Adkins Jones, what you just identified is a deeply spiritual journey. This is the journey. And it talks to it speaks to what the power of Black women is. The idea that I'm not auditioning, that it's hard to get there. We aren't born with that. We're born with a lot of people who are saying, get back, get back, get back. So how do we move out of that? If we're lucky enough to have had Dr. Reverend Katie Cannon say, okay, you're going to go do this. Or if we've been lucky enough to be under the mentorship of a Dr. Renita Weems, or whoever you want to name, but we find places, or praying grandma, just finding a way to get there. So one of the women that I interviewed years ago said it's about our process of getting off the cross. When we do that, that's what we have to do. We have to get off the cross. We don't have to serve everybody. We don't have to help everybody. We don't have to save everybody. We don't have to save every Black man. We don't have to, just the list of things that get put on us, we don't have to do. We have to save ourselves. And it's not selfish. It's a spiritual journey to be well.
Absolutely. That makes me think of, in terms of our construction of theologies, as we name that womanist theology spans beyond even its academic formation. Of course, it has deep ancestral legacies. And as a result, I believe as theologians that we ought to be using, womanist theologians use different sources that become our sources for theological reflection, biblical interpretation that look different from our other counterparts. So what are some of the sources that you use as you construct womanist theologies in a contemporary era?
So the teacher in me is going to say, first up, you could read womanist theologians, though, because I'm noticing, even amongst colleagues, that texts that are texts for me and my scholar, siblings, are things people have never heard of, or people love to throw out to pander, to use Reverend Dr. Watkins here, to pander a name or to pander a quote, don't know the context, don't know where it came from, ain't never even seen The Color Purple, don't want to ask questions. And so it to me, I seminarians, folks who are interested, but also Black women in the church, in spaces, practitioners, healers, read the works of our foremother. These are gifts. These are treasures. If you have not read Black Womanist Ethics, if you have not read Sisters in the Wilderness, these are texts that are withstanding time, and that I continue to go back to again and again, not only to teach. Dr. Mitchell, I have your book right here. I was just teaching it the other day. But to actually read the work, to take the time, to even have that sort of lectio divina, right? Like, I need to sit with this. I need to sit under these texts because it will make you read other texts differently, and it will change the way that you read scripture. I would say right now, something I would highly recommend that has been a beautiful gift, particularly just given the journey that it goes on, is Salamisha Tillet's In Search of the Color Purple. And her intersection, her walking and journeying with Alice Walker, who, in terms of thinking about where this term comes from and the legacy of that term, is just a beautiful, it's an incredible piece that came out and I think should be read in concert. And for me right now, I've actually really been interested and enjoying some of our, I've been teaching a Bible study for a while and doing some work with Toni Morrison. But during the pandemic, I really turned again back to Octavia Butler's work. And thinking about, I know that we're thinking a lot, Black futures and Reverend Dr. Butler was a prophet of our time. But I've been thinking a lot about, with N.K. Jemisin, thinking about Sophia Samatar, thinking about different works that imagine a broader space of cosmology, but also that are thinking about race, thinking about race lives, thinking about gender in some new ways, and spaces that stretch our imaginations and our hearts to imagine our worlds differently. So that's just been something, some text that I've been enjoying in my lack of free time.
Something that I am looking to engage in is around, Alice Walker talks about love of music with Womanist, and India Ari, she has this beautiful song called I Am Light. And I am going to be doing a Bible study with it. She has something called Songversation series. And she's singing, and then she has conversation, but then she goes into meditation and prayer through song. It is absolutely beautiful. So those types of engaging things, I am highly a mystic. I love meditation and introspective work. So things like that are things that really, to me, help us to center ourselves, to also breathe. As we talked about a few minutes ago, we have so many things thrown on us, and to value our belovedness. So those types of, mediums are what I like to offer in the space as I lead ministry. Another book that I have been using since I'm doing my DMin work at Union Presbyterian Seminary, shout out, Emily Towns' A Trouble in My Soul, Womanist Perspective on Evil and Suffering. Now, this book breaks it down to the Black woman's experience on evil and the things that happen or can happen to us. I'm doing my work around trauma and how that affects women's mental health, sometimes the microaggressions, just being a Black woman in America. And so this book has really opened up the narrative of Black women and the evil that we experience in this world. And so that book is something that has really helped me through my journey in this DMin program.
More recently, and I was writing down too some of these texts, and I love India Ari. I Am Light. I mean, that's gospel, right? It's gospel. It reshapes us. I recently was convicted by spirit, and I'm thinking specifically and talking specifically about the spirit of my maternal grandmother, who said, Michelle, how can you devote all of this time and energy into excavating resources, Black women's literary tradition, becoming an expert in these different topics and theory and method, and not tell my story? Mm-hmm. So my grandmother, she transitioned 20 years ago this year, this May coming up. And I was informed more and more about her story of growing up on a sharecropping plantation in Greenwood, Mississippi. And her fleet, or her freedom story, taking seriously the experiences of those women in our bloodline, is exceptionally important for our healing and transformation. We can't do the work of healing and transformation and creating and fashioning wholeness if we are working out of fragmentation ourselves. So I invite those who are listening to join with me. If spirit has hit you in that regard, to take seriously, draw from the wellspring that's in your blood, if you can, because that's a part of the key to our healing and research.
Can I say to that point that Yolanda Pierce also just put out a book calling us to that task I think it's In My Grandmother's House, and saying that we have to do that work, Michelle. I think you're exactly right.
I remember Kelly Brown Douglas, What's Faith Got to Do with It, when she starts out by saying, you know, why is Christianity, has it been both a bane and a blessing for Black people? And she turns back to this sense of the faith of her grandmothers as this kind of source to why she will still interrogate the Christian tradition, even with its complexity and its trauma that it has caused for Black people. One of the challenges that I have, even with this question on sources and on readings, is the kind of double work that womanists are asked to do. You won't read our work, but then you want us to give you the sources. Like, look them up. Go on Amazon and type in Womanist Theology. It's sources that you can point to that are starting points for, you know, for all of us to be expanded by the work. And to that point, I think one of the gifts that, speaking of Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, she talked about how early in her formation in the 1970s and into the 1980s, all she had were novels and other kinds of literary works, whether nonfiction or other, right, that pointed to Black women's authorizing of their God talk. And as she continued in her journey, you know, almost 40 plus years later, she realized that her syllabus contained not as many novels as before, if at all, but now there were actual theologians, Black women theologians, who had written texts that address certain themes. And, or if they weren't addressed, her students now had the ability to contribute new perspectives in places and spaces where there wasn't a word on that or that particular issue. So I want to invite folks who are watching us to also be mindful of that as well. Continue to post your questions. If Dr. Mitchum, did you want to jump in on sources or readings?
I was thinking in terms of looking back to your ancestors, but Stand Your Ground, Kelly Brown Douglas looks forward to what faith gives to children. And I was just thinking about the importance of understanding what goes forward too. So holistically, the back and the forward. One book that I've just started that I'm enjoying is Heather McGee's The Sum of Us. I think that's the title. But it's not a theological text. It's breaking down how she said she's worked all these years for social class injustices to be resolved, but it keeps going back to the issue of race, keeps going back to race. And so just thinking about what racism really does to us. So that's all I can think of right now.
I see a question in the chat from Adrian Bird. He's asking, is the 1619 Project narrative, or is the Project 1619 narrative a helpful or hindering paradigm for womanist historians today? I think that was a question back to our earlier conversation on 1619 Project.
I find it critically important because it reorients. It doesn't necessarily get into gender, into what goes on with African American women, but it reorients our story. And the fact that a woman did this, who actually, after having done this, has gotten death threats from people, and there's been this decided push in many Republican states to now the most important text for African American women, as in history, I think, is Darlene Clark Hines, or Hine. I keep putting an S at the end of her name. But Darlene Clark Hine has a multi-volume set on Black women's history in the United States that I think is critical. I think that the 1619 narrative is helpful because then it situates it into a whole picture. It has people who are looking at themselves and saying, I am connected to this history of enslavement. So I find it helpful. Other people might not find it helpful in their teaching or ministry. I find it helpful. And it makes my students' heads explode.
I see another question here from Sabrina Peer, who writes, in speaking truth to power, what does the womanist theologian speak to the Black male supremacists in the beloved community?
I will not worship you.
Sit down and listen. It's okay to take a seat. And also, let's have a conversation about misogynoir. Let's have a conversation about patriarchy. Let's have a conversation about power. Let's have a conversation about privilege. Let's have a conversation about egos. Let's have a conversation about money. Let's have some deeper conversations, because if you say that you love me, if you say that you love us, love is something that is accountable. We love with accountability. As various folks would say, we also have to think differently and be accountable for violences and harms, whether you feel you directly are involved with them or whether you feel you were inherited. But none of us choose the world that we are born into. We are held accountable for how we live in that world, though. And so I have some questions about how some folks sleep at night. I really do. But also that requires you taking off the mantle. And I don't care even if other Black women gave it to you, to take off that mantle and to see yourself clearly in the world, and to see the way that you were imaged in the world, to see the image that maybe someone else gave you of what it is to aspire to greatness or to vocation or to holiness. But to say that this is not something that is actually serving my community, but this is also not something that is serving you. That the violence is not only external, even if you cannot necessarily name that, in spite of the massive amounts of privilege and wealth that are afforded some of those who continue to go forth in the name of the Lord in our communities, who are male embodied. But again, that if we seriously have commitments to justice and freedom, then that doesn't mean yet a full excommunication. I say that my spouse is a pastor, but you know that means some very different and very difficult conversations and questions about how we see one another, and what has to change ethically, what has to change in terms of our actions. And some of that will mean, everyone wants to dismantle this hierarchy or dismantle that. No, some of that means that you have to give up something. You might need to emulate the cross a little bit more, but we're not going to go full atonement there. No, but there may be some sacrifices, and are you willing to do that for a greater vision of community? And do we even have the spaces that are safe, spaces that are sacred? I don't really believe in safe space. I do believe in sacred spaces. But do we have, if we don't even have the space to have those conversations or ask those conversations, then that's already indicative of a problem. And so figuring out how to address and move forward. And we have not held particularly cisgendered, heteronormative, and male-embodied clergy in the church, full stop, accountable for the kind of power that is amassed when one also says that they speak in the name of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And the amount of violence that power can do. And we've seen that across every denomination. We've seen that across every race. We've seen that across every class strata. The amount of violence, particularly sexual violence, that we have yet to be accountable for. And so there's a lot of things to say. And you can start with asking them if they've read some womanist works. That might be a good place.
I think this is a helpful kind of pivot to our conversation and into our conversation, that as folks think about womanist theology and its trajectories as we move forward, right? What do we look for womanist theology to help us to continue to confront or help us to continue to live into our own sense of wholeness and wellness? So I'll take conversation from everyone as we have a closing and final remarks.
Is that a cute?
Yes, jump in as you feel.
So I celebrate and look forward to participating and being inspired by the many ways that Black women are already speaking against patriarchal systems of domination through our activism, by denying these systems its power over us, over our thinking. I encourage us to continue to excavate and come to terms with our own power, our own relational, social, and economic power, and being able to leverage that in order to deny these systems its power, and to envision other ways of holding state-sanctioned systems and forces accountable outside of just the legal system, criminal justice system. Because the way that we fight Black male supremacy in the church and internalized sexism and homophobia and all of that has a direct correlation to the ways that we fight in the public sphere and in the shadows. And last but not least, one of the things I'm excited about is the work of womanist theology and praxis, of confronting the ways that we can be better sisters to each other, sisters to each other in the uplift. But I don't think we do enough work, scholarship-wise, on our relationships with each other. Dr. Renita Weems helps catapult us, to thinking about that, and I think we might want to return and do some back to the future kind of stuff. And so those are the things I'm excited about, and I look forward to contributing.
I think that I am excited about the continued energy of our intergenerational possibilities, not only around activism, but around traditions, around stories, around movement making, and around imagining other worlds. I gave birth about a year ago. Great timing. And so that has been really, really near and dear to me, to think about presence in new ways, to think about absence in new ways. I think, like I said, it's not lost on me the ways that our communities have been severed because of this pandemic, and particularly because of the way the pandemic only further exacerbated what was already racist systems of oppression within our network. But I'm excited because I see so many, and maybe they would claim themselves as womanists or not, and I'm okay with that, because womanism and womanist thought has to also continue to evolve and push itself and be accountable, right? It's not necessarily an end all be all. It's not something that we can just throw on as a banner. It does frequently make us legible in certain kinds of ways, but that continues to evolve and have a multiplicity of meanings. But I'm excited about, all of the ways that women are writing more, are reflecting spiritually, are getting in touch with a multiplicity of various religious and spiritual traditions, are crossing boundaries. I think about even someone like the NAP ministry, right? Are taking self-care as priority, are resisting these shackles of being a strong Black this, or, the mule of the world that, and are naming and claiming spaces in new ways. I certainly continue to see our changing and shifting networks give us different opportunities to communicate. And I think that when we're joined together, we are more powerful than we have even yet begun to realize. When communities of Black women get together and have our mindset on something and our heart set on something, I think that we can do anything we want in the world. And so I look forward to continued community building. And from a scholarship perspective, I look forward to I'm a junior scholar compared, to in terms of how the ranking and time goes. But I look forward to breaking, holding open doors and holding open gates and breaking open windows. We still need so many more voices. And for the legacy of womanist theology, for the legacy of womanist ethics to be so long, our list of folks working and teaching and being in different spaces is still far too short. And so it's something I'm deeply committed to is inspiring young Black women as preachers, as scholars, as teachers in every space I possibly can. So if you're watching and you didn't know, by all means, we're looking for you. But I'm looking for the next generation. Someone asked me if my daughter was going to be a womanist theologian. Now she could be, whatever she wants to be. She doesn't even have to be a she. You could do whatever. The world, the possibilities are endless as far as I'm concerned. But there are daughters and sons out there who continue to be called and continue to be anointed, continue to be, but maybe don't know it. So being that voice in the wilderness. I also just want to give a shout out that you're never too old. And so I want to give a quick shout out to my mother-in-law, who is an incredible teacher and who is one student at Union Presbyterian Seminary, and who continues to inspire me with her curiosity and her faithfulness in her journey, and who is, learning about womanist theology too, and maybe some of the ways that she's been doing it and continuing to learn in Reverend Melody's classes. So, I want to say that womanist theology is for all of us to learn from and grow with. So that's my little shout out of love in there too.
I want to jump in and piggyback on that. I am super excited about the empowerment of Black women the community, and just for me, it's spanning really broadening my scope of the literature that is there, how women are leading. I mean, it's amazing to meet you all on this panel today. You've encouraged me in so many different ways. The Womenist Institute at Union Presbyterian Seminary, with the womanist works, the womanist wares. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but I mean, it just excites me about how women's theology and voices are impacting the world. It is very exciting. So those things are exciting, but also healing. My mind's been around just the healing of Black women's lives and the trauma that we've been through and continue to go through, but yet the resilience that we have and the power and the grit that we continue to have, but then also caring for our souls as we continue the work of resistance is something else that Dr. Paula Parker, who is at the seminary, is deeply connected to that work. And I'm excited to work with her and just thinking about how can that healing work undergird and empower us as Black women to continue to do the work and this sustainability in this work that we have to do. So I'm excited about that. And I do have hope as a believer in Jesus Christ that the Black church is going to shift and embrace Black women more or better than what it has been traditionally. And so I continue to have that hope, but as we have talked about today, there's a whole lot of work to be done. Yeah, that's what I'll leave off with that.
So I'm going to flip the question, and I'm going to say that we can cultivate Black futures because of womanist theology and ethics. That sense of we're not auditioning, we already are here. And looking forward to that. Honestly, and it's probably because of the word futures, and I know somebody used the term Afrofuturism. So of course my mind went to the movie Black Panther. Sorry. And the role that the women played in the movie to pull everybody out of trouble and to help the movie to go forward. I mean, I just think of, the roles that we play. Sometimes we're in the lead, sometimes we're not. But I also think it's really important, you're talking about being in ministry and being in leadership and teaching and working. I want to stress writing. We need the texts. They don't all have to be about womanist thought. We need the texts. I will tell you, as someone who does a lot of work and just working around publishing, what doesn't sell is a book called How I Found Jesus. That's not going to sell. You got to go deeper than that. And what else is within you? And so writing those stories, being the one who does the next video on the Black church that incorporates African-American women's stories, being the one who writes the next Roots movie, next book of Roots, and instead of focusing on Kunta Kinte, focuses on Ifa Shea, in other words, on one of the women's stories. And so I think about that and the idea of even what it means to mine, taking one of Katie Cannon's terms, to mine our histories, to mine our stories, to mine who we are, to mine the mother lode, as she would call it. So I think all of that is important. And we also have to be really careful. I say this as someone at a primarily white institution. We have to be careful of networking. Networking is important, but we can't lose our souls in the process, because they will try to find ways to compromise you and to compromise your values. So knowing what your values are and holding to them, because it's not an audition.
A whole word. And I think that womanist theology adds to all of us by saying that violence against Black women and girls and violence, period, will not have the last word. That we'll continue to resist, we'll continue to survive, and ultimately fight for, confront, and in the process, dance towards the liberation of all of us. Thank you for joining us tonight. For those who are looking for more conversation on womanist theology, join us at our shameless plug at our 2021 virtual spring conference that takes up this very question, the hinges upon which the future swings. April 8th through the 10th, we'll be pressing more deeply into some of these questions that we name, and we appreciate your participation. You can also join us for our next webinar in April that is going to talk more deeply on martyrdom and this question of violence as well, in line with Easter and resurrection and all of these questions we have around Black suffering. So join us in April.